Marx did not leave us a logic. He left us one paradigmatic exemplar of his method in Capital. The method employed in Capital was largely misunderstood by 20th century Marxists. Apart from Lev Vygotsky, who grasped the essential idea behind Capital and applied it in the creation of a general psychology. Vygotsky's insight lay largely unknown until Ikyenkov's philosophical studies brought to the world, in general theoretical terms, Marx's analytical method. Thanks to Ikyenkov, the way was open to apply Marx's approach to any number of problems that confronted socialism. However, aside from psychologists who have been able to generalize from Vygotsky's work, there's been limited effort, let alone success, in applying the method of Capital beyond the same subject matter in which Marx had already exhibited the method. And that subject matter, bourgeois economic formations, is the richest and most general subject matter for dialectical analysis. And one cannot expect to replicate every aspect of Marx's work in the analysis of any other subject matter. But putting these ideas to work in political analysis is crucial. I've used the ideas about the relation of logic and history outlined by Ikyenkov in chapter 4 of his book on Capital in two studies. One on the foundations of political life and another on the Islamic Republic of Iran. This latter work was done in collaboration with a Persian scholar who had access to archives, etc., but the work was never completed as my collaborator managed to leave the country and had perforce to take up other tasks in his new country. However, I have enough to illustrate a 15-minute talk. The subject matter of interest is the present state of affairs in, say, Iran. We have the richest possible knowledge of this because we know it firsthand. We are interested in understanding the essential contradiction on which the regime is founded, by which it stands or falls. Our interest in history is solely for the purpose of identifying and elucidating that contradiction. Although the present state of affairs is given to us in perception, it is indefinitely concrete and complex. It is easy to presume that Marx knew from the outset that it was the value relation which was the essential contradiction upon which bourgeois society stood or fell. But this was not the case. Initially, the young Marx looked not to economics at all, but to the state. And it was not until the late 1850s that he determined the location of this contradiction in the value relation. This phase of analysis is crucial. The study of history must be combined with a provisional analysis of the current state of affairs by means of a study of current literature, and then looking back in history to find the point of origin of what seems to be the germ cell of the existing regime, and then tracing this provisional germ cell forwards. It is the forwards movement that allows analysis to confirm or disconfirm the provisional analysis. Ikyenkov quoted Marx, "It is not necessary to write the real history of the production relations. What is required is a genealogy beginning with the development of the supposed germ cell, tracing the transformation of the entire formation into organs of itself, if this is indeed what is found, in correlation with the conditions which enable that transformation." As Ikyenkov points out, it all hinges on the chosen starting point. When Michel Foucault regarded the current state of affairs from his own point of view, he saw modern society as an elaborate system of social control. Consequently, he found his origins in the development of the mass armies and modern prison system in the early 19th century. This is an example of what Ikyenkov meant when he referred to subjectivism and arbitrariness in identifying the starting point. Moving to the analysis of capitalism in Britain. Exchange of commodities with its unit of CMC had been around for millennia, but it had always been peripheral to social and political life. Capital and the units of capital, capitalist firms, buy in order to sell at a profit, M dash, had been around for centuries, and these helped create the conditions for the eventual dominance of capital. Many writers have traced the origin of industrial capital in Britain to the enclosures beginning in the 17th century, which created the massive landless peasants without viable means of support and concentrated in the cities. But the method of outright robbery on which the British aristocracy amassed their capital could not reproduce itself. Once the peasants had been robbed of their land, there was nothing more to steal. But when the early industrial capitalists gathered these proletarians together in workshops and paid them only enough to allow them to turn up to work the next day, just as poor as they were the day before, this was a self-reproducing regime, and it was able to transform all relations in society in its own image. So it was at the end of the 18th century when, thanks to the enclosures, a self-reproducing commodity became available whose use created surplus value that marked the appearance of the germ cell of capitalism. The capitalist could extend the working day beyond what was necessary to produce a day's labour. Thus, the unit of surplus value was a day's unpaid labour. It is often overlooked that the commodity was not the only germ cell of capital. Like Hegel in his encyclopedia, Marx used the identification and development of the germ cell numerous times in Capital. Let's look at the problem of finding a germ cell of the Islamic Republic, its origin, and the conditions under which it appeared. According to all available literature, the starting point of the current regime in Iran was the 1979 revolution, which created the Islamic Republic. And if you were to judge this revolution from press reports in the West, you probably believe that this was a revolution led by clerics who roused the masses and imposed a conservative theocracy. But if you were there, and if you look more closely, you would know that the people who made the revolution were an alliance of Marxists of various stripes and progressive Islamic students. What was meant by Islamic Republic at that time was what you could be called the uniquely Persian road to socialism, neither Moscow nor Washington, if you like. It was an urban movement led by young people, but how could these urban intellectuals neutralize the rural poor who favored the Shah and were reluctant to support the revolution? So delegates from the various revolutionary groups went to Paris and put Khomeini and his coterie on a plane and flew him back and used him to win the support of the rural poor to the side of the revolution. Nowhere in this revolution do we see a germ cell for the current regime in Iran. Having studied the political economy of Iran and its social structure and traditions through the literature of that time, we then move forward. The 1979 revolution unleashed an uprising amongst the industrial working class in Iran. They formed shuras, the traditional Islamic communes, and took control of their factories. But they lacked the cultural level to run the factories, so they allowed the bosses back under workers' control. The capitalists appealed to the mullahs, and the mullahs mobilized terror groups, not only from rural Iran, but from the Umat, the Shia empire outside of Iran, to terrorize the workers into submission and put the bosses back into control. But now the bourgeois were also at the mercy of the mullahs with their terror squads. This transition was complete by about 1981, and this is the germ cell of the present-day Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic reproduces itself by the expropriation of the proceeds of industry, especially oil money, which is extorted from the industrial bourgeoisie of Iran and pocketed by the mullahs and used to establish a hegemony consolidated by terror. Economic factors have led to a decline in the economic efficiency of this system because of sanctions and because of the clergy are merely parasites. They are no longer in a position to buy the support of the poor who had supported their coup d'etat. They are now mainly rely on their supporters in the surrounding Shia world. But as these countries gradually overcome the havoc of civil war foisted on them by the US and the Islamic Republic, the conditions for maintenance of this system is becoming exhausted. With the failure of the Islamic Republic to meet their needs, the poor in Iran at this point favor the return of the Shah. I will leave my analysis at this point. Analysis that determined the germ cell of the regime was not 1979, but 1981, the defeat of the workers' Shuras by religious terror squads, providing the religious leaders with the proceeds of industry to purchase the support of the poor. 1981 provided a self-reproducing formation because exploitation of wage labour had been given a specifically Iranian form. It is true that the 1979 revolution, at a time when the industrial working class was too small and weak to run the country on its own behalf, created the conditions for 1981, but it is not the same thing. The essential task then in the study of history is to determine the germ cell of the present day, most advanced formation. It was in Ikyenkov's chapter on the abstract and concrete in the same work I've referred to that we find an exposition of how once the germ cell is isolated, its further concretization can be traced as it colonizes, so to speak, all the other elements of the social formation. And in the process of merging with other relations, the cell is itself modified, ultimately able to reproduce itself out of the conditions which are its own creation. But as the germ cell develops, its inner contradiction, formerly enclosed by the relation it builds around itself, breaks out. And it is at this point that revolutionaries have the chance to determine the course of events. It is worth mentioning at this point that Hegel did not believe that history unfolded like some kind of giant syllogism. History does not unfold logically. According to Hegel, history is logical only in the domains of art, religion, and philosophy. However, in the development of any specific institution, history must exhibit its logic. In three ways. Firstly, the way in which a relation is first established, its initial conception, from a logical point of view, is arbitrary. But in the course of historical development, everything that is peripheral and accidental will be shed, and if the institution survives at all, necessity exerts itself and the institution gradually approaches its true concept. Secondly, the way an institution or form of practice develops from a simple germ cell is logical in, broadly speaking, the manner outlined in Hegel's logic. This is demonstrated in countless instances through the encyclopedia, including objective spirit, that is, social and political life. In this case, logic and history move in the same direction as a kind of genealogy. 3, the way an institution which is becoming the dominant relation in society transforms existing more ancient institutions into subordinate organs of itself, such that the developing formation becomes self-reproducing. It is in this sense that logic works in the opposite direction to history, inasmuch as the most ancient forms prove to be derivative forms of the central relation. I mention this because it is worth knowing that this was all in Hegel, and Hegel demonstrated this method not in 1 or 2 branches of science, but in scores. As a result of his extreme generalism and the primitive stage of science and bourgeois society at his time, there is much that is wrong in matters of detail and principle in his work. But nonetheless, Hegel has left us numerous models of dialectical analysis. There is nothing preventing anyone here applying what has been made accessible to us by Ikyenkov and Vygotsky, especially to the solution of pressing problems of today. We do not have to rewrite capital. Put the dialectic to work in the study of today's problems. In the example I cited, if we had mistakenly taken replacement of the Shah by a cleric as the germ cell of the Islamic Republic, we would misunderstand the current juncture in Iran. Our analysis made it possible to correctly interpret the recent reappearance in Iran of shuras, even in the countryside, the implications of the centrifugal process affecting the Shia Umat, the growing conflict between the poor and the regime, and calls for amongst the poor for the return of Reza Shah. Thank you very much.